Hello, one and all, and welcome to our continuation of the spoiler season reviews of the upcoming Kaldhiem set. Now, as you notice, it's a few days off. I did try to catch up on pretty much from this last Saturday. However, I did have to miss Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, mostly because I was recovering from food poisoning, which is not fun. It kind of knocked me out for a few days. I did still try to catch up with spoilers on Twitter and such, so I kind of gave my 2 cents on that. Other than that, I did have a big Twitch stream where I did cover all the spoilers that came from essentially Thursday, Friday, Saturday of last week. You can probably catch those up over there on my Twitch channel. Nevertheless, let's actually get started. We're going to kind of do this with lightning round kind of accuracy for the cards, just so that I can catch up from Sunday to today, which is Wednesday evening. Nevertheless, let's actually get started with this. Next up, first up, technically, we're going to talk about like I said, I am going to butcher these names. I apologize in advance. First up, Firja's Judgement. 1, 2 white and a black for an enchantment saga. It has, first step of the saga, create a 4/4 white angel warrior creature token with flying vigilance. So, Sarah Angel, pretty nice. Number 2, until end of turn, angels you control gain tap, destroy target creature with less power than this creature. Okay. Oh, and then the third step is angels you control gain double strike until end of turn. Whew. Okay, let's do this real quick. This card's really good. It's a pretty push card in this set. Like, seriously, the power level of this is kind of absurd. Now, it's not like the most broken thing ever, especially since we're still in the format where Gem Razor is a very popular card. That being said, there still is a very tempting card to play in the current format, because, 1, at the worst, it's still a 4-mana 4/4 with Flying Vigilance. That's a Sarah Angel. You don't mind paying 4 mana to play a Sarah Angel. Then, when you get to the next step, that Sarah Angel that you just created can actually be able to both attack in, since it has Vigilance, but also destroy a creature of lesser power, so it's just pretty much a targeted removal spell that's still an aggressive-oriented creature, which is legit nice. And then the third step, oh hey, then that singular angel gains double strike. Now that's just talking about if we only had that angel token that we had generated from the saga. As stated before, most likely the black-white archetype they're trying to encourage is the angel archetype. And if there is a very, very, very good incentive to go into the angel archetype, it's this card. Because this works as both a generator of angels. It generates 1 angel. It also works as a way to make your angels get an extra bit of oomph, being able to be targeted removal, and then be able to be used as a finisher. We're going to talk about it later. There's a few cards in the set that are going to actually be able to generate angels. Specifically, 1 mythic we'll talk about. So I can actually see some plays where you play this on turn 4, turn 5, go through the removal step, and then on the turn 5, before the last saga gets resolved, cast a spell or get a lot of angels on the battlefield, and then use it as a finisher because all of those angels will have double strike, and it is lethal. Plus, there's other cheekier methods that you can do with this card with changelings, so keep in mind, changelings are also affected by this since they're angels. Like I said, the only con about this card is it's one of those that, to get to the better aspects of the card, you do have to wait till turn 2 and turn 3. And like I said, Gem Razor is a popular card in the format, and from what we're seeing, a lot of these sagas are very, very powerful. So there could be an incentive to essentially tech in enchantment hate cards. But the best thing about this card, though, is even if they hate out the second and third step, which will suck, you still get the 4/4 Angel, which is still a aggressively oriented creature that you can also use as a defensive creature. So, overall, I think I'm still going to give this a high score of 9 out of 10. This card's just really, really good. Like, it will probably see a lot of play. It's going to see a lot of play if the Orzhov Angel list is a thing. Oh, also, not to mention, this with Yorion is going to be a little bit nutty. Just saying. Next up is Aegar, the Freezing Flame. A 3-mana 3/3, so granted, we're used to 3-mana 5/5s in the format, or 4/3s, but 3/3s are not bad. It's an Izzet card. It's a legendary creature giant wizard, so giant travel, wizard travel, take note. It has the ability that whenever a creature or planeswalker in opponent control is dealt excess damage, if a giant / wizard or spell, keep in mind the spell aspect of it, you control dealt damage to it this turn, draw a card. Okay, this is a really, really nifty legendary. First of all, a free mana free, that's a hill giant to a basic extent. That's perfectly fine, and the fact that a hill giant is a legendary giant wizard, flavor, win of the day, yada yada yada. But what's nice about this card is just the factor that it has a lot of way to become a pretty decent card draw engine, because most giants in the format are big creatures. Heck, even, it's kind of like a flip-flop of something. Like, let's say you put this in the wizard deck. A majority of wizards, for the most part, have ways of evasion, like they either have flying, or either they have a way to essentially try to sneak in for combat damage. They're kind of like if you use combat tricks, because you're doing wizards, so you're trying to do instant sorcery speed shenanigans. So from that one, you should be able to at least sneak in for some points of damage, or actually, no, that's not the best way to put it. The best way to actually put it is with a majority of wizard decks, they have like semi-combat tricks to help protect their wizards and such. So with that, then you should be able to, when your wizard gets dealt damage and you deal damage to it, you should be able to have a combat trick that should, in general, deal the excess damage, which is going to help you do the card draw. Think of stuff like semi-small targeted combat tricks, or also like board-wide combat tricks. Think of it like that. Then if we go on the opposite end of the spectrum with the giant aspect of it, a majority of giants, with the exception of this legendary, ironically enough, are pretty hefty creatures. Like, there's a very chance that if your opponent has to jump block, that it's going to deal the excess damage. So you should be able to get the card draw without much sweat, unless you are evenly powered. And even then, there is still the aspect that whenever a spell can deal excess damage, you draw a card. Which that is not hard. Remember, we're in a format where there's a lot of deal damage spells in the format. And even we have targeted burn damage spells that you can make sure to deal excess damage with it. Plus, there's damage modifiers like, oh, the one from Core 21 that I always forget. It's like Magmatic. Someone's going to tell me in the comments. But essentially, damage modifiers like that, you know, ones that increase your damage by a certain amount, that could actually help out make your spells very powerful. And we also have a bunch of Etz ones in the format. Like, I think this is the card that if Perforos's Intervention is going to be popular in the format, it's going to be this card, because this card actually makes Perforos's Intervention a pretty nifty choice. Still, it is still susceptible to removal, and a free dies to some of the more earlier removals in the format. I still think it's good, but it is one of those cards where to get most of its effect, you either have to A, play this when you have a bunch of giants, or have a bunch of wizards on the field that can deal excess damage when they go into combat, or you either have to essentially make sure you play this and hold up a big Etz spell of sorts. So, I still think it's good. Like, I'm going to give it like a 7 out of 10. But I think it's more going to have fun commander potential than standard potential. But still, the giant deck is forming. We're going to see a few more cards of the giant variety that can make the giant deck pretty probable. Let's just put it like that. Next up, Narfi, Betrayer Keen. A legendary snow creature zombie wizard. Other snow and zombie creatures you control get a +1/+1 boost. And this has an activated ability of free snow to return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. And of course you can always pay snow mana, and it's a 4/3. Okay, let's just get this out of the way. Yes, if you're going to play this card, you're probably going to make the Pinky in the Brain joke of saying Narf when you play it. Yes, let's just get that one out of the way. Nevertheless, the card itself is actually a pretty decent Tribal Lord. Like, if you're playing the Snow deck and you're in these colors, you might give this card a shot. And if you're in a zombie Tribal deck, or a deck that generates zombies of some sort, especially with some spells that we're going to talk about that do generate zombies pretty easily, then this might just be a decent Lord just to put in the deck. Now, granted, we're in a standard format where Lords are not that popular, with the exception of like a few fringe cards, at least if we're talking specifically standard. However, this is one of those cards that I think the most powerful aspect of it is just the factor that it can return itself to the battlefield at instant speed. So you can literally, if you need to, just wait till the end of the opponent's turn, pay your free snow, bring this back in, and then it can attack as a 4/3. That's, I think, is going to be the most powerful aspect of this card. the Lord aspect of it is just a nice cherry on the top of the sundae, so to speak. Nevertheless, I do think this card is still just... It's still like an uncommon legendary, so it's not too pushed, but it's good. Like, it's a 7 out of 10. Maybe even an 8 out of 10 if you go into the Zombie Snow Tribal deck design. Next up, Battle for Bretegard. 1 in Selesnya for an Enchantment Saga. It has Step 1, create a white human warrior creature token. Step 2, create a green elf warrior creature token. And then Step 3, choose any number of artifact tokens and or creature tokens you control with different names. For each of them, create a token that's a copy of it. Overall, pretty decent card, actually. Just the factor is that by itself, like if you don't do any modifications, this basically amounts to create 2 tokens throughout the free saga steps, and then next turn just create 2 more additional tokens, which, if you're in like a go-wide deck design, that's perfectly fine, especially if you have other spells within your deck that generate tokens. Then this card gets a lot better. Like, let's say you go into Naya and you generate, like, a lot of, like... You play that 2-cost spell from Ikoria where you generate a dinosaur and a human token. Stuff like that. Well, that's a different human, since it's just a human. Keep in mind, even though things can share tribal types, they are still going to be considered different tokens if they have different names. Like, for example, a human warrior and a human are going to be considered different tokens. So, just keep that in mind. Because they technically are different, so then when you do the not proliferate, I'm having a brain fart. Populate? Yeah, populate. The populate mechanic, essentially, which is the third step, more in a nutshell, then you would be able to create those extra tokens. Plus, also remember, it also says artifact tokens as well. So if you have any treasure generation within your deck design, or even generate of food, since food is a popular mechanic still, thanks to Eldraine, you'll be able to create additional food tokens or additional treasure tokens, so don't sleep on that. I think the cheekier application that I'm going to try this card with is actually in a Bant deck, where I'm actually going to have this, a couple of other Sockers, and do Dance of the Mance, and then essentially try to Dance of the Mance, return this as a creature if I pay the X enough mana for it. I think it was like 6, if I remember correctly. And then essentially bring it back as a creature. It goes through its steps, and then when it gets to its last step, when it resolves, you can actually create a token copy of all the sagas, since they are technically considered creatures at the moment. If my memory serves me correct, though, when they are created, they are going to just become the sagas themselves and not become the creatures. But still, that is still a nifty little trick to just get a wide board space. Nevertheless, this one is... I feel like you have to put this in the right deck, but if you are a tokens deck, you're in Selesnya, which, look, granted, if you're playing Selesnya, you're probably playing tokens. You probably will like this card a lot, so I'll give it like around 8 out of 10. It's that good if you're in tokens, especially if you have any additional token generation like treasures, food, etc., etc. Next up, one of the more interesting sagas we got, it is the Beast of Litjara, I think is how you pronounce it, a free cost saga at rare with Simic, and it has, first step, create a 2/2 blue shapeshifter creature token with Changeling. Nice. Oh, step 2. Any number of target shapeshifters you control have base power and toughness 4/4. Keep in mind, this is a permanent stat increase. So let's, for example, say that you only have the 2/2 Changeling you have at that moment. When you go to the next step on that one, it is going to permanently be a 4/4. So keep that in mind. And then there's step 3, where it's choose up to one target creature or planeswalker. Each creature you control with power 4 or greater deals damage equal to its power to that permanent. This is a really interesting card. It's interesting because there's a part of me that wants to think it's good. There is also where I'm a little bit 50 on it, and I think the card's not great. Here's the reason why. Let's say if you just play it... The thing is, when I look at these sagas, I like to look at them at their base component. So, the base component here is you're going to get a 2/2 that, in theory, can be any creature type. So, if you are trying to do some type of tribal type shenanigans, then you can have pretty much a 2/2 elf, 2/2 giant, etc., etc., etc. So, then what you have is, since technically it is considered a shapeshifter no matter what type it is, you then are going to get the next step, which then will increase its stats by 2/2 permanently, which is fine. And then the third step is that it could hopefully remove something. Now, the best way to take advantage of this card is if you either go into a Changeling tribal deck or have some other ways to get additional Changelings. Maybe you're playing like the MDFC Rogue from Zendikar Rising that keeps being a shapeshifter, so keep that in mind. So let's say you want to copy like a powerful 2-drop of some sort, then you like play this, get the token, and next turn that copy that you have as well as the shapeshifter you generate become 4/4, stuff like that essentially. There is some good shapeshifters in the format, you just have to keep looking around. So there is a chance that you could make a shapeshifter tribal deck of sorts. But at its base, it's just create a token that becomes a 4/4 inevitably, and then it removes something, which is perfectly fine. It's not great, and yes, there is the incremental value how you could make this absurd if you go into Changeling Tribal of some sort. But I think the basic component if this card's ever going to be popular, it's just the fact that it's going to make a Changeling token, and that it can be inevitably used for removal if the token survives. Which, that's the problem. The problem is you have to have a 2/2 token survive, which in a format with Bonecrusher Giants, at pretty much all the black removal we have in the format, I don't know if that's possible. Maybe? I'm going to say a legit maybe there, but I don't know. I still am optimistic, and I kind of want to give this a 7 out of 10. But I've seen a lot of people overhyping this card, think it's going to be absurd, but I don't think you want to overhype it. I think it's good, but I don't think it's like going to like be a meta-dependent card, if that makes sense. Okay, this card excites me. Mystic Reflection. 1 in a blue for an instant. Choose target non-legendary creature. The next time one or more creatures or planeswalkers would enter the battlefield, they enter the battlefield as copies of the chosen creature instead. Oh, and also has a foretell of 1 blue. I really like this card. Here's the reason why. Because there's just so many angles you could actually approach this card design. Like, for example, you could put this in the tokens deck, for example, and let's say you have a powerful... Like, let's say you generate... Like, for example, let's actually go back to that Changeling saga I was mentioned previously. Let's say you want to find a way to get to multiple, like, Changelings and such, and you have a way, like, once you play that, you have another spell that generates, like, 2 tokens or such. Well, if you have the excess mana to actually cast the Mystic Reflection, then you can essentially target the Changeling. Those tokens come in, and since they come in both at the same time, they will change into the Changeling archetypes. There is also more cheekier applications, like I think many people are mentioning how this with a token generation and stuff like, say, Terror of the Peaks is kind of absurd. Or like the EDH application of casting this while the ETB trigger of Avenger of Zendikar is on stat, which... Targeting Avenger of Zendikar, which, yeah, is absurd. It's absurd. But it's also a good, like, counter-tech card, because the thing is, we have a lot of popular planeswalkers and also just very aggressively oriented creatures. Think your Cresting Peace, Elder Gargaroth, etc., etc. So being able to use this, if you can have a consistent board presence of, like, tokens or either things that are creatures that you don't mind your opponent having, just being able to, on their turn, when they try to cast their Cresting Beast or even cast their planeswalkers like Ugin or the new Tibalt or such, being like, nope, your Ugin is now officially an elf token. Or a Shapeling token. That is really absurd and hilarious. It's a great hard counter that's not negate. It's cheeky. It reminds me of stuff like Polymorph, which is really cool. And it's a Polymorph that you can both use in an aggressive-oriented strategy, but also use as a defensive-oriented strategy, which makes the card really, really good. Like, this is a 9 out of 10. I can see this card at least being in the sideboard, but I could see some people at least being janky with it in the main. So, keep an eye on this one. This one's going to be pretty quick. Goldvein Pick. There we go. 2 mana for a artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+1. Equip 1. Whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, create a treasure token. Honestly, I think this is one of those weird cards that can, of all things, actually see play in mono red. Mostly because we still have Fervent Champion as a card. And being able to turn 1 Fervent Champion, turn 2 this, give your Fervent Champion a +1/+1 boost, and then be able to attack in, it's most likely going to deal combat damage because your opponent probably doesn't want to block. and still generate the treasure token, which you can either use as shock or mana ramp in the next turn. I think I could see some mono-red decks giving this card a shot, just because the incremental treasure generation you could get from equipping it to Fervent Champion is pretty good. So, yeah. With that, it's kind of like a slight 7 out of 10, because the factor is I think it might actually be a really good card for that deck. Obviously, if you have any Realm token generation and such, it's good in those decks as well, but I think it's actually going to see its place in mono-red. I'm not joking. Next up, Funeral Longboat. 2 mana, a 3/3 vehicle with vigilance, but it also has crew of 1. It's been a while since we've seen a vehicle with crew 1. Like, the last time we seen this was specifically Smuggler's Copter. And yes, this is not a Smuggler's Copter, but a 2 mana free with vigilance, and anytime you generate a token or a creature that you can't attack in because summoning sickness, being able to use the Longboat as just an aggressive card or a defensive card, that's not bad. Like, yeah, it's not Smuggler's Copter, it's not Heart of Kirin, but I can see it sneaking into some decks. I'm just going to put it like that. It's a pretty sneakily good card. Plus, also, if you're in Vigilance Tribal, well, yeah. Also, you could mutate this, which I don't know if you want to mutate this over the Chariot, like I mentioned before, but, we'll see. We shall see. Next up, Draugr's Helm. 1 in a black for a artifact equipment at uncommon. When this enters the battlefield, pay 2 in a black. If you do, create a 2/2 black zombie berserker creature token, then attach Draugr's Helm to it. Equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has menace. Overall, I think the card's fine. I do think it's one of those that one of the decks I've been trying to think about is making an equipment flicker deck that especially if we get to cycle these cards, since we already seen the giant equipment that makes a giant wizard token, and now we see this that makes a zombie. So I'm wondering if we're going to get a whole cycle of this. If not, then I am really tempted to make like a Yorion flicker deck, where if we can get excess mana, we could flicker our equipment, generate a bunch of those tokens and such. So it's something on the back of my mind. It's still like a 6 out of 10, but I do think there's some janky applications. Next up, Battle of Frost and Fire. Cue Game of Thrones reference here. Anyway, it's a 5 mana saga. It has Step 1. This enchantment deals 4 damage to each non-giant creature and each planeswalker. Sheesh. Step 2, Scry 3. Step 3, whenever you cast a spell with converted mana cost 5 or greater this turn, draw 2 cards and discard a card. Yeah, we know how I've been saying that sagas are pretty good in this set that might encourage enchantment removal? This is one of them. Though, this one actually not so much to some extent, because the best part of the card is obviously the first step. This is 1 mana more to get essentially a Storm's Wrath, a giant board wipe, that also deals damage to planeswalkers and such, which, if you're in a Giants deck, this is actually really, really good, because then your Giants are protected. Also Changelings, keep that in mind. So then you essentially just keep your board and you deal damage to your opponent's board. Though, if you have Planeswalkers in your design, your Planeswalkers are going to deal damage unless there's a secret giant Planeswalker in the future, which, I don't know. But, yeah. Nevertheless, this is pretty much a really good board wipe, and if you can get to Step 2 and Step 3, they're perfect gravy. Like, being able to scry free, never underestimate scry free. That can help filter out your draw pretty well, especially to draw into the final step, and being able to cast a spell for mana cost 5 or less, being able to draw and discard a card. I can see this either in the Giants deck, because obviously you're going to have either 5 or greater drops, but I can also see this in a spell-oriented design deck, because you're still going to get the board wipe, you're still going to get the scry, and if you're running like 6 costs like instant and sorcery spells, like that big counter module spell we got from N21 is one I can think of right off the top of my head. Just being able to essentially cast that spell. But the problem is you do have to do it during your turn because the saga will conclude. So, that's a weird one. Because yeah, you have to do it you have to do it at the end of your turn, or else the saga is going to fizzle. I don't think this is permanent. I'm pretty sure this isn't a permanent effect, so... I mean, I guess if you're a sorcery speed control deck, if you're a sorcery speed control deck, you're actually going to be beneficial with that effect, so... Give it an 8 out of 10. It's a pretty good card, and if you're in a Giants deck, you're probably going to play this card. No sweat around it to the pepperoni. Next up, the Cyclone Summoner. 7 mana for a giant wizard. It has, whenever this creature enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand, return all permanents to their owner's hand except for giants, wizards, and lands. So obviously if you're playing giants or you're playing wizards, it's a card to at least consider. Though I will say 7 mana is a lot, especially if you have to cast it. However, we are in a format where ramp is a thing, and being able to return like your opponent's entire board presence, with the exception of their lands, presuming that you're not going against the mirror match, there's an argument here, especially the fact that even after that whole bounce effect, you're still getting a 7/7 giant, which is nothing to sneeze at. Now, granted, you can't really do flicker shenanigans with this, since you do have to cast it to get the Cyclonic Rift type of effect, so you gotta keep that in mind. Still, I could see it as a 1 or 2 of in some giant lists as just a sneaky tech card, so I think it's a 7 out of 10. I'm not going to go high on it because still 7 mana is a lot, but if you're playing this in Commander and in some fringe giant travel standard decks, I think you're going to be fine with a 1 or 2 of in your list, if I'm being honest. Next up, I'm so excited for this card, Rune of Flight. First of all, called it. Like, I originally did a prediction videos of what runes were going to be, and this is pretty much close to it, so called it. Anyway, Rune of Flight. 1 in a blue for an enchantment or a rune. Enchant permanent. When Rune of Flight enters the battlefield, draw a card. As long as the enchanted permanent is a creature, it has flying. But as long as the enchanted permanent is an equipment, it has equipped creature, has flying. So overall, good flavor on point. I do like this card a lot. This is coming from a person, though, who one of his favorite previous cycles in Magic was the cartouche cycle from the Amaket block. So I always have a heart for kind of like cheeky aura cards like this. And this one's a pretty cheeky aura card. Keep in mind a few things. One, since the fact that it enchants a permanent, it means it sticks on other kind of like permanents and such without falling off. Like, you don't get the aura problem where if you like, let's say you put this on a man land. Like, the problem is when you try to attach auras in the past to man lands is that they will fall off when they essentially become a land again. Not the case with this one. Since you are enchanting the permanent, when the man land, like if you enchant a man land, it's still going to stick. So when you activate that man land and make it become a creature, it's going to have flying. So this is going to be really nifty. Like, one of my previous brewing specials was actually making a whole entire few decks around Crawling Barrens. And this is probably going to be another brew I'll do in the future, like the Rune Crawling Barrens deck, because just being able to attach this and make my Crawling Barrens have flying, that's going to be awesome. Also, since it enchants permanent, keep in mind this can also affect other permanents. So if you have like planeswalkers or enchantments that become creatures, think of stuff like that Sphinx enchantment that we had in M21, wherever you cast a non-instant spell, it becomes a free with flying. So if we get other better runes and other colors that can give it other status effects and such that might be better for the Sphinx to have, then you can play kind of like a Rune Sphinx deck, which actually would be kind of a cheeky budget brew, if I'm being honest. But we have to see the rest of the set of the runes. Nevertheless, this one is more of a bias, but I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. I don't know if it's going to be competitively viable, but this is more out of love for these type of card effects. But overall, if I'm being realistic, without the bias, it's an 8 out of 10. It's pretty good. Not going to lie. Next up, Search for Glory. 2 and a white for Snow Sorcery. Search a library for a Snow permanent card, a legendary card, or a saga card. Reveal it. Put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. You gain 1 life for each Snow spent to cast this spell. Overall, a pretty good card. Like, now granted, it depends on if we're in a format where tutors can be, like, played. Because there are some formats where maybe the meta is so fast that it's really hard to justify a turn with tutors. However, one beneficial aspect of this tutor is the problem with tutors is they're either very, very specific, or if they're not specific, they have a cost. Specifically, kind of like, for example, if we're talking like Grim Tutor, you have to lose life, or like, let's say, Idyllic Tutor, you can only look for a specific enchantment. Now, with Search for Glory, while you are still restricted, you are a pretty wide range of the cards you can get. You can get a Snow permanent, which we're going to get a lot of Snow cards in the set, and being able to search for a land for this, so keep that in mind, such as you have Snow lands. Or just a legendary card. Yet again, a lot of the more powerful cards in Standard are legendary creatures, keep that in mind, and those coming in the set are legendary, keep that in mind. as well as saga cards, and as we mentioned before, the sagas in this set and Pharaohs are absurd. Like, being able to search for glory on turn 4 to get a turn 5 Elspeth Conquers Death, that is nothing to underrate. And also, if you're in the snow deck, being able to gain at least up to free life, that actually kind of sort of negates the initial cost of this, because sure, you might get dealt damage when you do the tutor, but you're going to gain that life back due to the life gain of Search for Glory. So I am really optimistic about this card. I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. I think this is one of those cards that if snow is going to be a thing, they're going to at least play a 2 of this card, because being able to get specific like win conditions and such, especially if they are within these requirements and able to get a little bit of life after it, especially if your deck has life gain synergies, hint hint, wink wink, nod nod, you might like this card a lot. Just saying. Just saying. Next up, Shepard of the Cosmos. 6 mana for a 3/3 creature angel warrior flying, but also has Foretold, a 3 and a white, so you can cast this for 4. And it has an ability that when it enters the battlefield, return target permanent card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. And it's a 3/3. Mostly I'm talking about this because I think this is a decent card for Angel Tribal, but mostly because this is kind of like a toned down Sun Titan, but still a Sun Titan is pretty good, especially with the fact that since we have like a fetch land like Fabled Passage or Evolved Wilds in the format, so being able to return like a Fabled Passage and just ramp, that's perfectly fine. But also the aspect of this, we also have a lot of cheap early game sagas that are in white, think like the one that makes the Artifact Defender creature. Wow, I am having brain fart on names tonight. That's what happens when you do lightning round, kids. You forget names pretty easily. But there's a lot of cheap sagas that you could able to return like this and start the saga over again. Also, protective creatures like the Alseid of Light's Bounty. Being able to early game protect something by sacrificing bounty and then being able to return it with Shepherd of the Cosmos is pretty nice, I'm not gonna lie. So I think this is a 7 out of 10 card. I think it's pretty good. So don't sleep on it. Squash. 4 and a red for an instant. This spell costs 3 less to cast if you control a giant, and then deals 6 damage to target creature or planeswalker. Honestly, I'm mostly just notifying this because I do think this is the cheekier new Pauper card of the format. A lot of people, like one of my friends who plays Pauper regularly, kind of wants to make the giant Pauper deck, and they said that this is a perfect addition, so I'm just going to go off their note and still say 7 out of 10. Obviously, you want to go in the Giants deck before you brew this, but who knows? This being an incentive to make giant Pauper a thing is a fun food for thought, at the very least. Next up, Weathered Runestone. 2 generic mana for an artifact. Non-land permanents, cards in graveyards and libraries can't enter the battlefield, and players can't cast spells from graveyards or libraries. This one's simple. It's an 8 out of 10. It's a tech card. It is a tech card that is really good in the format currently, since we have stuff like Lurrus and Genesis Ultimatum. I seen a rebuttal on the Twitters when I was talking about this, countering Genesis Ultimatum, where it's like, people are like, well, they still get to draw 5 cards because it's a choice, so still, isn't 7 mana drawing 5 cards still not great? Yes, but it's better than Genesis Ultimatum, than playing 3 lands and an Ugin and a Elder Gagaroth. Yes, the factor is they are still going to draw 5 cards, but the thing is they still have to spend mana to essentially play the cards out. So in other words, they are losing the mana discount that they would originally get by playing those for technically free. So yeah, Weathered Runestone is probably going to be a popular sideboard card in best of 3, essentially. But I can also see some people just sneaking it in best of 1, especially if specifically popular archetypes that are related to these mechanics that this is hating out get popular. So keep an eye on this. Also, I love that it's uncommon because I do love tech cards when they're uncommon or common because that makes it easier to craft. It's really hard to recommend crafting rares to people, especially on Arena, but uncommons and commons, relatively easy, so it's great budget tech option. So overall, 8 out of 10. This one's pretty quick. Basalt Ravager, 4 mana. It's a 4/2, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals X damage to any target, where X is the greatest number of creatures you control that has a creature type in common. This is actually a pretty good card. It's a Flame Tongue Kaldu that can target the face. So if any tribal decks that go wide and can splash red, I think are going to give this a shot. I'm just saying that if John Elves is going to be a thing because they want to use this as their splash for red, I'm not going to be surprised is what I'm saying. Overall, 7 out of 10. I think it's going to see some play, to be legit honest. Next up, Harald. Yes. King of Skemfar. It's a Gagaria legendary. It's free mana, elf warrior. It has menace, which is nice. But it also has, when this creature enters the battlefield, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal an elf, warrior, or Tyvar from among them. For the record, for those who don't know, Tyvar is a planeswalker that's within the set. I talked about it previously on that Twitch review, as I mentioned before, so you can go watch that. But you reveal one of those cards from among them and put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Overall, it's a fine card. Free mana, being able to draw a card, that's perfectly fine. We've seen these cards see play. If Elf Tribal is going to be a thing, they are probably going to play this card because being able to get a Elf or Warrior or Tyvar, really, really, really good. Especially if you can get Tyvar out of it. Mostly, like, with Elves, you want to go wide, so you want to constantly be able to generate card draw to actually generate your board presence. And Harald pretty much does that. It gets you either an elf that you can build your board with, it either gets a warrior, which a majority of the elves are warriors in this set, so that's just another way of saying, hey, you're going to get an elf. Or you could get Tyvar, which Tyvar overall is a generally good planeswalker in my opinion. So yeah, I think it's an 8 out of 10. If the elf deck forms, it's going to play probably 3 to 4 of these cards, if I'm being honest. Next up, Toralf, God of Fury. 4 mana for a legendary creature god. It has Trample, it's a 5/4, and it has whenever a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls dealt excess non-combat, keyword non-combat, damage, Toralf, God of Fury deals damage equal to its excess to any target other than that permanent. It also can be, it's an NDFC, so it can also be Toralf's Hammer. 1 in a red for legendary artifact equipment. A quick creature has 1 in a red, unattached Toralf's Hammer. It deals free damage to any target. Return Toralf's Hammer to its owner's hand. A quick creature gets plus free, plus 0 as long as it's legendary. And you can equip it for 1 in a red. This one's pretty easy. It's a 9 out of 10 card. I know a lot of people are sleeping on this card or don't think this card is that amazing, but I say keep an eye on it. Mostly because we do have a lot of Et's burn spells in the meta, and we are getting a lot of more board wipe effect spells in the meta, so just being able to use this, like, think Perforos's Intervention. Like, that can deal Et's twice, so let's say you put Perforos Intervention for 4, that deals 8 Et's damage. That's a little bit overkill. But being able to use the Et's damage that you would to deal damage to the opponent or to another creature, that can make Perforos's Intervention into a board wipe spell that can deal damage to the face. That's pretty silly. So yeah, if Toralf is going to see play, it's because Perforos's Intervention is a card, and we do have a lot of Et's burn spells / board wipe burn spells in the format. And even then, what makes it go over to the 9 and the 10, like, with that itself, if we were just talking about the front part, that would just still be like a 7.5 to 8 out of 10. But the factor is, it can also be the Hammer. Yes, the Hammer is the most unimpressive aspect of the card, but the factor is, you can play this early, you can equip it on something, and then be able to unattach it to deal free damage to any target. That's a Lightning Strike. You can deal Lightning Strike and just essentially control the board tempo or board presence, essentially, and then it returns to the owner's hand, which then, if you need to, you can then later down the line play Toralf, God of Fury when you got spells that can benefit from its effect. And even if we don't talk all of that, it is still a 5/4 with Trample, which is a pretty good stat for a 4-cost creature. No, it's no Questing Beast, but it still has about as much Tets as a Questing Beast. Joking aside. Nevertheless, yeah, 9 out of 10. It's a very versatile card. You can play it early, you can play the equipment early, you can play this late, and then if you have any spells like Perforos's Intervention or Et's burn spells, that become board wipes, so being able to make what was originally a singular targeted burn spell into a board wipe-based type multi-targeted spell, essentially like Arc Lightning, that's nothing to underrate, and also perfectly flavorful for what is the equivalent of the God of Lightning. In my opinion. So, yeah, 9 out of 10. Maybe even 10 out of 10 because of flavor, but it's a 9 out of 10. Next up, Egon, God of Death. 2 and a black for a legendary creature god. It has Death Touch at the beginning of your upkeep. Exile 2 cards from your graveyard specifically. If you can't, you sacrifice this and draw a card. But it also can become the Rune of Death, which specifically is a 1-mana legendary artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, mill a card, and has 2 and a black to exile a creature card from your graveyard, draw a card. And yes, cue the Ghostbuster. Hey, Egon is a card. Joke here. Probably somebody's going to make an Ultra of it, if I'm being honest. Nevertheless, this is a weird card. At first glance, you don't think it's that amazing until you kind of think on it. It's kind of like the Toralf deal. Well, worst case scenario, if you don't want to play it on turn 3, you can still play the Rune of Death, which, I'm going to say it, Rune of Death is probably the better-ish card of the bunch, because still, if you're in a reanimator deck strategy of some sort, and you hope you don't go against Runestone, like I said, Runestone is going to be a really good tech card. But if you are trying to play reanimator, then this is just a nice, decent card. Just being able to mill cards into your graveyard that you're inevitably going to reanimate, or escape with, if you're playing with Pharaoh's escape cards, so it's a way to fuel your escape mechanic, so you got to keep that in mind. And also, itself can just have an activated ability of exiling a creature card from your graveyard to just draw a card. Perfectly fine. And don't ever underestimate the front part of this card, too. Just a 3-mana 6/6 Death Touch doesn't sound that amazing, but it's a pretty defensive and aggressive card. Like, if you have any way to give this trample, it's going to deal a lot of damage, is what I'm saying. And even at the worst, if you don't have cards to exile and you have to sacrifice this to draw a card, as I believe Dev from Strictly Better Magic the Gathering pretty much said it, this is just like the equivalent of cycling. Or it could have been Saffron Arf. It's one of those two content creators. Somebody's going to probably mention in the comments. But they brought up the good point that essentially it's cycling. You're spending free mana to do with cycling, which we have seen triumphs in the format. So if this is just free mana, be a temporarily blocking creature, and then next turn draw an additional card, that is perfectly fine. Plus, also, it's a card that goes into the graveyard. You can reanimate it with stuff like Call the Dark Dwellers, so you gotta keep that in mind. So, I'm still not too high on it, even with all what I said there. I still think it's good in the specific decks that want this effect, so I'll be optimistic and say 7 out of 10, though there's a part of me that wants to say 6 out of 10, just as a pun, because, hey, it's a free mana 6/6. But nah, it's realistically a 7 out of 10. Next up, Jorn, God of Winter. 2 and a green for a legendary snow creature god, so this is our snow god of the set. It has, whenever this creature attacks, untap each snow permanent you control. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then it also can, since it's an MDFC, it can also be Kaldhiem, the Rime Staff. 1 blue and a black for a legendary snow artifact. It has, you may put target snow permanent card from your graveyard this turn. If you do, it enters the battlefield tapped. Okay, first things first, yes, this is going to be a fun commander card. Like Sultai Snow, people try to make the Snow commander deck work, and this is actually a pretty nice one. Just being able to make Sultai Snow work, because you do have the incentive here, just whenever Jorn attacks, untap everything. That is, in a semi-sense, both a mana doubler, but also kind of like a combat trick, because if you're playing a lot of snow creatures within your deck design, that's essentially saying all your snow creatures have vigilance, which is not a bad effect. Plus, also, if you have like anything within your deck design that when a creature untaps, do something, that's also something to keep in mind, but that's more like for eternal formats and such, but it's something to consider. So for EDH, I think this card's going to be pretty good. For standard, though... Okay, let's talk about it. I feel like in standard, it's going to be a little bit overhyped. Mostly because of a few things. One, it's a free mana free. And remember, we are in a format where Lovestruck Beast is a card where essentially... And a lot of, like, 4/3s, like, there's a lot of aggressive-oriented creatures at free mana that is better than a 3/3. Which wouldn't be that bad if it weren't for the fact that you have to attack with Jorn to essentially get the effect. Now, a good argument one can make is that if you put this in a deck where essentially you have, like, a combat trick, and then what you do is you attack with Jorn, you essentially attack, and then your opponent will try to block it because they don't want the mana doubling effect. You still get your untapped snow permanents, and then you have mana still to be able to semi-protect Jorn, God of Winter. I can see an argument for that. No denying that. But I do think that's just kind of going to be kind of like a fringe deck. I don't know. This is one of those cards where... Plus, also the factor is, it doesn't attack instantly unless you have a way to give it haste. So, there's the factor is that that's the two goals that this card's going to have. One, to get the mana doubling effect, you have to wait a turn or give it haste. And then you have to attack and hope that it survives if you don't have a combat trick. So, will people try this card out? Yes, mostly because many people are going to look at this and be like, oh, this is like Wilderness Reclamation for snow. No. Wilderness Reclamation was a much busted card. This, not so much. Because remember, Wilderness Reclamation, you could stack. Jorn, you cannot stack. It's still good. I still think it will see play, especially if the snow deck exists, but I do think it's a little bit overhyped, to the point that I'm just going to give it a 7 out of 10, because I think it's a good card, but I don't think it's as busted or broken as people state it to be. And quick note, I will admit the Rhyme Staff is cute, because technically if you have both Jorn and this out, you can technically activate this, get your snow permanent in tap, and then when Jorn attacks, you can untap this and untap this artifact, and then be able to do the effect again to get another snow permanent out. That is a really, really cute effect of this card. But still, it's a decent reanimated spell if you're in snow, and this is an instant speed effect, so I do think this aspect of the card will make it powerful, so... But you do have to go into Sultai Snow, and whether Sultai Snow is going to be a thing, we'll find out. Though granted, mana fixing with the World Tree is going to be really, really good, so keep it in mind. Nevertheless, 7 out of 10. That's the final of it. Next up, the white mythic of the set, Starnhiem Unleashed. 4 mana for sorcery. Create 4/4 white angel warrior creature token with flying and vigilance. If this spell was foretold, create Exodus tokens instead. Okay, this is interesting. I will say, if we didn't know about the Angel Saga we started this video with, this card probably would have not been that great, but since now we know that card exists, this card becomes a lot better. But even if we didn't know that saga exists, I still think it's a good card. Because here's the thing. If you need to, you can on turn 4 cast this and get a 4/4 white angel warrior creature token with fly and vigilance. That is decent. Now, I will admit, the problem with token-based strategies at the moment is that we do have a lot of good singular target removal that can essentially destroy tokens. Granted. And that's the reason why token strategies do struggle a little bit in the format, unless you do like a polymorph type effect. But at worst, this is a 4 mana that, and the best part is, if you foretold this like on turn 1 or on turn 2, this is a free mana 4/4 white angel warrior creature token with flying, which is pretty good. Like, even if it gets removed, you just only spent free mana on it. That's perfectly fine. And then this is a card that then later down in the game gets really, really better. Like, if we're talking about that enchantment that, oh, the one step before it, all your angels gain double strike, being able to, like, put at, like, let's say, realistically free into this, or actually more realistically 2, being able to just pay 5 mana after you cast that saga when it gets to its second step, and then have 2 additional angels, which then next turn will deal double strike damage. That is nothing to underrate. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. So, I know a lot of people were kind of disappointed with this card, but I'm going to disagree. I think this card is like a 8 out of 10, mostly just because it's a versatile card. Is it going to see play in EDH? Well, if you're playing Angel Tribal, probably. Are there better Angel generators in the format in EDH? Yes, but this is still a decent, versatile one, so... Plus, also, you can bring it back to your hand and recast it, so it's something to keep in mind. Nevertheless, though, it is a... I'll say 8 out of 10. It's good. It's not amazing, but it's really, really good, especially since it has early game usage to late game usage, especially if you're playing this in Orzhov Angels and you have that saga. Like, this is going to be your finisher if you're playing that saga. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. Next up, Burning-Rune Demon, 6 mana for a Demon Berserker. When this enters the battlefield, you may search your library for exactly 2 cards not named this creature that have different names. Keep that in mind. If you do, reveal those cards. An opponent chooses one of them, put the chosen card into your hand and the other card in your graveyard, then shuffle your library. Overall, pretty good card in my opinion. Just say 6 mana 6, it's fine, that's perfectly fine. And being able to use this to get 2 cards out of your library is really fine. Yes, your opponent's going to choose, of course, the worst one for you to get. But 2 cards, if you make your deck right, both of the choices are still cards you're going to want to build the board presence with. Or even better, like if you get like 2 creatures and you're playing like a Reanimator deck design, your opponent's going to have a bit of a rough time when you choose like 2 really aggressive late game creatures. They put the one that they think is the less worse into the graveyard, and then like you reanimate it next turn, and your opponent's like, oh no. So there are ways to brew around the quote-unquote cost of this card. I still think it's like an 8 out of 10. I think it's good, but really it's going to be very dependent on the pace of the format, though. If it's slow, it will see play. If it's too fast, probably not. Next up, Elderfang Disciple. 1 in the black for a Elf Cleric. When this enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. Now, why am I giving time for what essentially is a burglar rat? Well, it's because of those creature types. The fact that it's an Elf and it's Cleric. That's really, really good, especially since the Elf and the Cleric decks seem to be encouraging a Reanimator-based type package. Plus, you can also play this in Loris to get the repeated discard effect for your opponents. So, don't sleep on this card. I think it's actually going to be a lot more applicable in the meta. So, enough to say that's a 7 out of 10. So, keep an eye on it. Next up, Harald unites the Elves. Still, the name of Harald is just kind of hilarious. Anyway, it's a 4-mana enchantment saga. It has 3 steps. 1. Mill 3 cards. You may put an Elf or Tyvar card from your graveyard onto the battlefield. Okay. Step 2. Put a +1/+1 counter on each Elf you control. Okay. Oh, and step 3. Whenever an Elf you control attacks this turn, target creature an opponent control gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Okay! This card is nutty. If the Elf deck exists, it's probably because this card is a thing. Because first of all, this is a 4-mana Reanimator spell. Like, granted, and you even mill to actually essentially reinforce the Reanimator engine, and you can return both an Elf or a Tyvar Planeswalker. That is really, really silly. Just being able to 4-mana dig 3 cards into your deck and just reanimate an Elf from there, or if you already have them in the graveyard, just be like, oh, you removed my Tyvar. Oh, hey, I'm going to play this and bring back my Tyvar. Or bring back one of my powerful Elf cards. Like, just the fact that this can be used as a way to rebuild back up your Elf army if you have, like, targeted removal and such, that is really good. Plus, being able to put a +1/+1 counter on each Elf you control, don't underestimate that, especially with Heartless Act in the format. So being able to get counters on your Elves, which then make them really hard to remove, that's really good. Oh, and the final step is ridiculously absurd. Just whenever an Elf you control attacks this turn, target creature and opponent control gets -1/-1. That can kill off some creatures, especially if you have a wide enough board state with the Elves. So, I'm going to be optimistic on this card and give it 9.5 out of 10. It's that good. Like, I think if the Elves deck is going to be a thing, it's not because Tyvar exists. It's not even because Harald exists. It's because Harald Unite the Elves exist. Next up, Eradicator Valkyrie. 4 mana for a Angel Berserker and Mythic. It has flying, lifelink, and hexproof from Planeswalkers, which is interesting. It also has a boast ability of 1 in a black. Sacrifice a creature. Each opponent sacrifices a creature or Planeswalker. I think this is more of a good tech card. I don't know if this is a good card, though. And the main reason why I don't think it's that great is because, well, here's the thing. The hexproof from Planeswalkers is a really, really weird semi-clause to the card. I'm just going to say that. Now, granted, we are going to get cards like Kaya in the format. We're also going to get Tibalt in the format, and Egon, and cards that, and we already have cards in the format that do, quote-unquote, deal damage to a quote-unquote creature if it can. So there might be times where this in the sideboard, if you know your opponent's playing a very popular Planeswalker, that can be used as targeted removal. You can sideboard this in just to be able to have a creature that can be protected from that Planeswalker. That's a perfectly fine element of the card. But it's going to be very dependent on the meta. I'm just going to say that. It's going to be very, very dependent on the meta. And still, a 4-mana 4/3 with Fly and Lifelink, perfectly fine. I don't know if it's like great with the Yorions in the world, but I could be wrong. It's hard because I'm also a little bit more optimistic on this card because it's an angel, and we still seen that saga that is ridiculously absurd. So being able to make this have double strike later down the line with lifelink, that's really absurd. So I'm gonna be a little bit more optimistic on this card than I would be. I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10, but I think it's an 8 out of 10 in the sideboard. If you try to mainboard this, I think it's more of a 7 out of 10, but we'll wait and see. Next up, Rally the Ranks. 1 and a white for an enchantment. As this enchantment enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Creatures you control the chosen type get +1/+1. Honestly, I think it's a really good card. Mostly because if tribal decks are going to exist, this is actually a really, really decent aura for tribal decks. Or not even an aura, it's just an enchantment. So let's say you're playing this in Cat Dog Tribal, just being able to play this late game and name like Cat or Dog and get all the +1/+1 boost, that's nice. You can even play this early, like let's say, for example, you're playing Angel Tribal, because it's a white enchantment, so that's probably a good chance going to go into that deck. Being able to make your angels get +1/+1 boost and then make them 5/5s potentially, that's going to be really good, along with, yet again, I'm going to sound like a broken record. Trust me, a lot of people were pretty amazed that Orzhov enchantment saga exists. So being able to make your angels into 5/5s, which then, when you get to the second step of the Orzhov saga, you can now deal 5 or destroy something of 4 power or less, because your angels are 5/5s. Or sits if you get another of these Rally the Ranks on the battlefield. Sit 7/7, etc., etc., etc. Then this card gets really good. Now, granted, the only catch-22 is it's going to be kind of hard for the timing of this card, because you're going to have to determine... It's one of those things with these tribal Lord effects, since it's not a creature itself. You have to determine when you want to play this card, whether or not you want to play it on, like, just get it out of the way, but then you don't build your board presence, or you build your board presence and then you play the Lord-like effect. It's going to be dependent on the board state and the pace of the match you're going against, but still, overall, I do think it's a good card. It's like a 7 out of 10. Like, it's good, but you need to put it in the right decks. Next up, Rise of the Dreadmarns. 2 and a black for an instant, but you can foretell it for 1 black mana. It has create Etz 2/2 black zombie berserker creature tokens, where Etz is the number of non-token creatures that died this turn. Whoo! Remember how I was talking about that zombie Snow Lord, and how I said that if there was a way to make a bunch of zombies, that it might actually see some play? Point. So yeah, pretty much what you can do here is, if you have anything in your deck design of a board wipe, now, granted, black is kind of awkward since they do have board wipe-ish type cards, but you can't really use Extinction Event since the creatures do have to die. Keep that in mind. But if you have any like mass removal spell that is Destruction type within your deck design, being able to hold this Foretell spell up and then use your Destruction spell, or even use it as insurance, like let's say you're building up your board presence and then your opponent's like, okay, I'm going to Shadow the Sky. Then being able to be like, okay, you do that, but after that resolves, I'm going to cast this spell and then create like 3 to 4 to 5 or 6 even Rise of the Dreadmarns, which then, if you have mana remaining, that you can then reanimate the Zombie Lord and then make all those 2/2s into 3/3s. That is ridiculously absurd. I'm going to be a little bit optimistic on this card. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. I might be being too optimistic, but I think this card's really good. Next up, a personal favorite of mine, Kaldur's Viscious Return. 2 in Rakdos for an enchantment saga. Step 1, you may sacrifice a creature. When you do, Kaldur Viscious Return deals free damage to any target. Step 2, each player discards a card. Step 3, return target card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Put a +1/+1 counter on it. Oh, and also it gains haste until your next turn. Yeah, this card is pretty nutty in my opinion. I like this card a lot. Okay, first of all, just 4 mana, being able to sacrifice something to lightning bolt something, that's really, really good. Especially if you have creatures that you don't mind dying. Like, think about cards that have death triggers and stuff like that. So if you have cards like that in your deck design, just being able to get a free sack out of it and then being able to deal free damage to anything that you need to deal damage to, great. Step 2, each player discards a card. Perfectly fine effect. You don't even mind discarding a card because that might fuel your Reanimator shenanigans. Oh, and then once you finally get step 3, being able to return a target creature card, and it has haste, and it gets a +1/+1 counter, which protects it from stuff like Heartless Act. That is really, really absurd. Granted, they know it's coming, but it's still really, really good. Now, if there's anything that's going to keep this card in check, it's probably because Scavenging Ooze and Graveyard Hate style cards are popular in the format. Also, Weathered Runestone is in the format, so you gotta keep that in mind. But, I don't know. I think I'm a lot more optimistic, because even if you don't get the Reanimator aspect of this, sure, if you get every aspect of this card, it's really great. But even then, just the step 1 effect, being able to get a free sack and deal free damage to something, I think is what makes this card really good. So, I'm gonna be optimistic and give this like a 9 out of 10. Yeah, I really think it's that good. Really. I'm not kidding. Next up, Reckless Crew. Free and a red for sorcery. Create Et's 2/1 red dwarf creature tokens where Et's is the number of vehicles you control plus the number of equipments you control. For each of those tokens, you may attach an equipment you control to it. I know a lot of people are down on this card, and I'm a little bit too, though I will say one teeny little rebuttal that makes this card at least semi-decent. Remember that we're getting Magda in the format, and Magda does have the ability that whenever an elf becomes tapped, you get a treasure. So I can see an argument or a world where you play like a dwarf equipment / or even just a dwarf vehicle deck, and then you like get your vehicles out, you get Magda out, you didn't play Reckless Crew, you get all the elves, you get all the dwarfs, and then you tap them all the crew specific vehicles, which then dates the Magda's effect, you're going to get treasures. I could see a world where that is possible. Also, keep in mind and still like other cards that are powerful equipments are in the format. Just being able to quick equip to dwarfs to become either efficient blockers is nothing to sneeze at either. Especially like let's say one of the dwarfs get equipped like with a Shadow Spear. Well, that's a free 2 with lifelink and trample. So yeah. Plus, we also have equipment in the format that synergize with warriors, so you gotta keep that in mind. Well, no, wait, they're berserkers, so... Okay, scratch the warrior clause. But still, just... There is powerful equipment in the format that being able to freely equip it to these cards, it's nothing to underestimate. Like, we have that one cheap Throne of Eldraine equipment that's 1 green that gives, like, a significant stat boost, but the catch-22 is that the equipment cost is ridiculously expensive. Well, with Reckless Crew, if your creature that originally had that card got removed by spot removal, you can just play Reckless Crew and then just re-equip it. Which is actually pretty good. So, Reckless Crew, I'm going to be a little optimistic on this and give it a 7 out of 10. I think it has potential, but I do have to admit it's for a very, very fringe deck. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. Next up, the card that people probably want me to talk about, Tibalt Strictly. 1 in a red for an instant. Counter target spell. Cue color pie discussion here. A lot of people thought, wait, is this breaking the color pie? Red doesn't get counter magic. First of all, it kind of does, but it has a cost. And boy, does this one have a cost. So let's read this whole text here. Counter target spell. Cool. However, you choose 1, 2, or 3 at random. Its controller of the spell that's getting countered mills that many cards. Then exile cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card with a different name than that spell. They may cast that spell without paying its mana cost, then they put the exile cards on the bottom of the library in a random order. So, first things first, let's get this out of the way. Why does it make you mill random cards? It's because they don't want you to be cheap with this card and be like, oh, I'm going to counter my own spell, but before I do that, I'm going to cast Vampiric Tutor and get an Emrakul on top. That's the main reason why it has the mill random number of cards there, so you can't be cheeky with that. Though I do think a lot of people are going to try to be cheeky with this card and try to treat it like a polymorph-like effect, essentially, where they're going to try to counter a ridiculously cheap spell and try to get a ridiculously big spell out of mana curve, essentially. So you gotta keep that in mind. That could be a possibility of what people are going to try to do with this card. That being said, a majority of the time, it's also going to be tried to use as a counterspell, which Is this a good counterspell? Yes and no. Yes, on very specific spells where if you're going against like an opponent that is like, say, doing a specific, let's say, like a specific late game finisher card. Like let's say you're going against the Cycling deck, for example. And of course the finisher they have in those decks is the Zenith Flare combo. Or the Zenith Flare, where they try to make Zenith Flare and deal like 30 damage or something. If you counter spells like that, where they're going to be like finisher-like cards, you don't mind that they're going to get a free spell. Especially if, like in the Cycling deck, like chances are they're going to get like a 1 or a 2 drop. At best, they're probably going to get that one Cycling spell that makes them draw free cards, but that's pretty much it with that. Chances are they're going to get a card at the lower curve, and then it's going to be relatively good. However, this is a card you want to be really careful of because there are some decks that have multiple finishers within their deck design. And then this is where the card gets a teeny little bit worse. Like, for example, most people have been pointing out, oh, this can actually help counter Temur Ramp because you can counter Genesis Ultimatum. Yes, but remember, the reason why Genesis Ultimatum decks work is because they use that to cast multiple late-game threats using the spell. So, sure, you counter their Genesis Ultimatum, but you're going to probably accidentally give them an Egon. That's pretty bad. So I think this is one of those cards where you are going to do it. Yes, even in those fringe circumstances, you are still going to counter the spell because you still have a very, 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 very slim chance of them getting something that is not mattering in the grand scheme of things. But do keep in mind, there is the risk. And that's why this is actually a very flavorful card, because it is a red card because you are playing Risk to play the card. Whether or not you're counting your own spells to essentially try to more or less try to get something beneficial out of it, or if you're counting something from the opponent and hoping they don't get something good out of it. You are dealing with the variance of their deck, so you gotta keep that in mind. However, one little hint I'm going to give about this card, if you're using this to counter one of your spells being counter, my best advice, don't try to counter their counterspell. Counter your own spell instead of them trying to counter the spell, because then you still are going to get something out of it, essentially. If you try to counter their counterspell, they're either going to get a free feint out of it, or they're going to just get another counterspell to initially try to counter it. So, keep that in mind. Just a little tip if you're going to play with this card. I think people will play with this card, because this is both going to be I think it's going to be a pretty good standard card, but I also think this is going to be a great EDH card, because in the grand scheme of things, when you look at this is pretty much Chaos Warp that can only target a spell in the stack. And that's really, really cool. I'm not going to lie about that. So, I'm still going to be optimistic on it and give it like a 7.5 out of 10. I think it's a good card, but I don't think it's like a busted, it's going to break the format card, in my opinion. There's a lot of risk when playing this card. Don't underestimate it. There are some times where Tibalt is going to get the trick out of you by playing it. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. Next up, let's talk about this card. Divine Gambit. 2 white for sorcery. Exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment. But there's a cost. It has to be one that an opponent controls, and when you do, that player may put a permanent card from their hand onto the battlefield. Now, the problem is this card was spoiled the same time as Tibalt was spoiled. The Tibalt Trickery one that we were talking about previously. And I wanted to make sure to review these cards back and back just to talk about a point here. A lot of people were kind of making the argument on the Twitter sphere of being like, oh, white doesn't get any good cards, even though they got a really good Mythic and they got a good Orzhov enchantment, but that's besides the point. But they're like, but this card is so bad compared to Tibalt that breaks the color bind. No, it doesn't, as we mentioned before. This card is just so bad. It's not that good. I'm going to say something that's a little bit controversial. This is a 7 out of 10 card. Yes, it's actually not that bad. It's actually good. Here's the reason why. Remember how I was mentioning with Tibalt Trickery, the problem is you're going to have to deal with the variance of your opponent's deck? This one, the variance of it is a lot smaller compared to the variance that you have to deal with Tibalt's Trickery. While with Tibalt's Trickery, you have to deal with the variance of your opponent's, or even yours, entire deck. This, you only are dealing with the variance of your opponent's hand. Which, to be frank, is a lot less costly. Now, granted, are you ever going to play this on turn 2? No, 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 don't do that. Never play this on turn 2. I'm just going to say that right off the bat, never play this on turn 2. You have way better early game removal in the format. Don't ever play this on turn 2. However, this as a turn like 4 or 5 later down the line, it's actually perfectly fine. Because here's the thing. The best way to play with this card is that you're going to play with this. You exile something, which exiling something is very powerful, especially in a format where we have stuff that can be reanimated or such, or returned back to the opponent's hand with stuff like Balagad or such. So, being able to just exile and get rid of it permanently is great. And the thing is, once they play their free permanent, you still will want to play with a secondary removal spell that you're going to have in this hand, because you're going to play this in a control deck where you're going to have a response to their secondary thing. Like, everybody's been telling about the worst case example where it's like, oh, I'm going to remove the Lovestruck Beast, and your opponent's like, oh, I play an Ugin on turn 4, ha 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 ha. Here's the thing. You play this on turn 5, they played an Ugin, you banish and light it. Or, better yet, let's say you play this in Azorius control. You Divine Gambit, they played an Ugin, and then you bounce it with Genesis Ultimatum. Because remember, it's only a permanent spell. They can't like cast a cheap spell like, say, Genesis Ultimatum or such. They're just only going to be able to play a permanent. And we have a lot of ways to deal with permanents. So, and some people might ask, well, couldn't you just play the control spell when they play it and then they're wasting mana? Yes, but there are times where you actually want them to cast a spell for free and get the timing of being able to remove their problematic card. Like, for example, like when I'm talking about the Ugin, the thing is, sure, they play their Ugin for free, but remember, you still have priority. It's still your turn since this is sorcery speed. So you have the ability to either A, interact with the card and remove it before it gets to their turn. You have the priority here. That's the thing that I think many people are missing about Divine Gambit. Yes, they get the permanent for free, but they are missing the tempo they get from being able to play it on their turn, especially if it's like a hasty creature or a powerful planeswalker that they want to activate like that. So I think that's the main thing that people are missing about Divine Gambit. They are missing the tempo or the power you get from being able to play it on your turn, because they get greedy of the mana discount that they are going to get. Now, am I saying is this the best white removal card in the world? Absolutely not. Like I will be surprised, other than like from some realms of politics, that this sees EDH play, other than just being some fun politicky stuff. But I think in Standard, this is actually a lot more playable and not as much of a trap card as people are stating. I think Tibalt's Trickery is more of a trap card than Divine Gambit is. So, 7 out of 10, I think this card is a lot better than people granted, and if I'm wrong, well, I'm wrong. But I think that's going to be my controversial review statement. This card's a lot better than people take it at granted. And last, but certainly not least, and personally my favorite card that they spoiled, Maskwood Nexus. 4 mana for an artifact. Creatures you control are every creature type. The same is true for creature spells you control and creature cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. And it has an activated ability of 3 mana for create a 2/2 blue shapeshifter creature token with Changeling. Okay, first, here's my response when I first saw this card for the first time since Amazonian spoiled it. Here was my response. And I gotta act this out a little bit, so if it's a little bit over dramatization, I apologize. Yes, I was that excited when this card got spoiled. Why? Because this is the absolute, like, most people who know when they're watching this channel, they know that I like to do jank brews. And this is the most absolutely jank brewing card that we got from the set. Because the factor that it changed the rules that all your creatures are every creature type just puts a whole new page on janky brews in Standard. Like, you know how I've been talking about all the tribal cards that have the specific tribal synergies? Well, the factor is, with Maskwood Nexus, you can make a deck where there's those multiple of those tribal synergy cards within the same deck design, and just be able to synergize with it thanks to Maskwood Nexus. Like, your giants can become elves, your elves can become angels, cats can become dogs, dogs can become cats, rain is pouring from the heavens, hallelujah, we got some proper jank that we're going to do with this, I'm going to tell you that right off the bat. Now, is this going to be a competitive card? Probably not. The only way I can see this card being competitive is if the minute you play it, you're going to get a synergistic effect. Like, one I think of right at the bat is, like, let's say you're playing Magby and you're playing, like, a Dwarf Tribal with some additional cards within your deck design, for example. Being able to then play this on turn 4 and then tap all your creatures and generate Magby's effect, or even get the power buff, like, from the Lord effect, essentially, which then can help you win the game. Think of it stuff like that. Like, stuff that once you play this, you're going to get the Tribal Lord-like effects on all your creatures, and then be able to go for a finisher. Like, let's say, for example, you play an elf deck. You're playing Apps and Elves. Let's make an example of that. You play an Apps and Elves, and then you play that... Oh boy, I'm going to sound like a broken record. You play that Orzhov Saga that mates an angel and gives your angels double strike. Well, on the second turn, you can essentially make it where you play Maskwood Nexus. Now, granted, I don't think they're going to get the Step 2 Saga effect where your elves would then become angels. They're not going to get the effect of the angels having the static effect of being able to destroy something because they weren't angels when the saga went into play. I don't think that happens. However, if Maskwood Nexus stay on the battlefield and you got next turn, all your elves that are now technically angels are going to have double strike. And there are also cards in the set that give your elves Death Touch. You kind of see where I'm going here? I feel like there's going to be kind of like a tribal of some sort of deck, and I am going to try this out. Like, I'm going to try a lot of janky brews around this card. This is going to be the cornucopia of most of my janky brews, probably during the early access, and probably throughout the year on my jank deck tech videos. Plus, also, if you're playing Party, this is also really good with Party, because then you could just generate a bunch of tokens of any type, and then the changelings will make it into party members of each individual type, so you can fulfill party requirements a lot more easier. Like, imagine having 4 tokens on the battlefield. You're playing, like, in swamps and such. You play Maskwood Nexus on turn 5, you spend 4 mana, and then you can spend 1 black mana for that tutor spell that's party-specific, and then able to get a free spell like that. Like, stuff like that. So overall, like, if it's my Janky Brew heart, I'm going to say it's a 10 out of 10 card in my heart. But if I'm being realistic, it's more of a 6 out of 10. Unless someone can make, like, a tribal deck where it's a very competitive deck archetype. Nevertheless, that's all the cards that I thought would be best to cover that were spoiled the last few days. I'll try to keep these updated daily now, just to keep up the pace and such. Nevertheless, thanks for all those who watched to this point. I hope you enjoyed the 2 cents on these cards, and I hope you all have a lovely day or a night when you're watching this. If you do, please like and subscribe for more future opinions on these cards, and also for potential janky brews. And also top deck thoughts. So, see you later. Bada beep, bada boop.